Welcome to the Ben and Tony podcast, and today we have Steph Smith. Steph is the head of trends at The Hustle, which was recently acquired by Hubspot. Trends helps 10,000 plus entrepreneurs stay ahead of the curve by providing thousands of vetted business ideas and a community that helps make your next venture a reality. Steph is originally from Canada and is a data-driven writer and growth marketer with many projects under her belt. She spent several years at Toptal, working on their design and leading their publications team, and she has many other projects related to making products, coding, and hopping across the globe as a global nomad. She reaches hundreds of thousands of readers on her personal blog, where she actively writes about remote work, productivity, and women in tech. blog.stephsmith.io is where you can find her. Steph Smith represents a new type of professional, a remote, prolific creator eagerly focused on learning and exploring the new internet economy. Her growth mindset has taken her around the world as a global nomad living across 6 continents, exploring and then pioneering business ideas as the head of trends for The Hustle. Steph has a very thoughtful perspective on the world, and her many frameworks, like exploring versus exploiting, really help me think about the way I'm approaching life. Hope you enjoy this episode. And make sure to subscribe to the Ben and Tony podcast.
Between writing a love letter to Excel and playing chess at a national level, it's clear that Steph approaches life with an analytical skew. I found this particularly interesting given the nomadic, free-flowing lifestyle that she's chosen to live by. Listen to this conversation for discussions on culture shock, on remote work hubs, approaches to lifelong learning, and much more.
And we're very excited to be sponsored by the Making Lemonade Fund, Gen Z's fastest growing fundraiser, supporting COVID-19 relief, pediatric cancer, and a bunch of other great causes. Get behind them over at makinglemonadefund.com and sponsor made by our very own Jessie K.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you. Now, Steph, so right now you're dialing in from California, but you've lived in a lot of different places,
Yep.
originally from Canada. Now, could you tell us maybe just to introduce yourself, so where are you from in Canada, and what were you doing when you were growing up, and what were you interested in?
Yeah, so I'm originally from Toronto. All I can remember from early days is that I've always loved things analytical. So the best way to put it is that just even from early days, I would much rather be in a spreadsheet than a Google Doc. It's funny because now some people know me for writing, but I've always liked all things analytical. I ended up from that going and doing my degree in chemical engineering, and then ended up pivoting my career several times after that. But yeah, I think in general, the through line of everything I do now, even though some of it is less classically analytical, is that I love anything that I can analyze and I can understand and use data to really grow or to change in some way.
Well, it sounds like the first sort of transition period that we talked about here was kind of an intentional decision, right? So could you maybe start to tell us about that story? So to set the scene, you were studying in Toronto, you were studying chemical engineering, and you made a decision to study abroad and go on an exchange. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it's not that exciting of a story. I mean, a lot of people go on exchange. The university that I happen to go to, a lot of people went on exchange, but very few. You could probably count it on 1 or 2 hands when they're in engineering, just because these particular courses that you needed to take during your degree, it was really hard to find universities that paralleled that. And if you did, a lot of people had to take an extra year. And I somehow found a way to not do that. But I was one of the few in my program to go abroad, and I had traveled when I was really young to Europe maybe a couple times, but those were just for, embarrassingly enough, chess tournaments. So I never had really lived abroad or really done
Hey, hold
things
up. There is nothing
abroad.
embarrassing about a chess tournament. We're going to have to dig into that one later.
Sure, but I mean, I just went, that was my first time living abroad, and it was also my first time just realizing oh, things can be done differently. And anyone who's been abroad or lived abroad for a significant amount of time recognizes a lot of these things of just like, oh, a lot of my preconceived notions about the way the world should work like aren't actually true, and like there's actually way more opportunities than I thought out there, and everything that I thought was like my next 5 years maybe isn't. And so that was kind of like the first instance where I was like, oh, wait a second, like things aren't how I maybe initially thought they would be.
So do you have specific examples of like something that you experienced when you studied abroad in Sweden, right? And a way that maybe changed the way you think about the world, even just a small way.
Well, so Sweden has a really interesting educational system. So the university that I went to was one called Lund, and Lund was rated, at least internationally, way higher than Queen's, which is the one I went to in Canada, even though Queen's is one of the better Canadian universities. But honestly, Lund was so much easier than Queen's from just like if I were to just judge them purely off of like how much work I had to put in. But what was interesting is like a lot of the people who are trained out of Lund are just as smart, just as talented, just as capable. They just have a way different approach to teaching. So for example, in Sweden, and I think this is true like across Sweden, not just Lund, they have a completely different grading system. So instead of like a percentage system or a GPA system, at least in many of the courses there, it's just pass or fail. And then in some of the engineering courses, it was 3, 4, 5 or fail. And other things like you would submit assignments and they would again be pass or fail. And if you failed, they would just tell you how to improve it such that you pass. But honestly, coming from a North American system, at first you're like, what is this? Like, this is like so strange. It doesn't make any sense. Like, why would you have a system like this? But really that kind of mimics what things are like in the real world. And it forces people to get to learn the information and be able to pass versus get a certain grade, right? Like you're either, if you work in a job, or you're not getting graded if you're like a 95th percentile or a 60th percentile, you're graded on like, can you do the work? Are you capable of this? And so it was really interesting to see. That's just like one example of how just the way that they educated people was so different. And in fact, like I told you the rankings around the world, that university is actually ranked much higher. And I can bet it's probably because people come out of there and they're just as, if not more capable. It's just a different way of operating. For me, coming from Canada, which is also quite a socialist country, well, maybe definitely less so than Sweden, but parallel in some ways to Sweden, it wasn't so much of a culture shock, but it was really cool to see and just like learn about, like, for example, in Sweden, everyone literally, they get paid to be educated. Like if you go to university, instead of paying for your tuition, you not only get that tuition free, but you get paid to be there. Not a large amount, but like it covers your living expenses. And so it was really interesting to see like what's the next notch in terms of like more of a socialist society. And as someone who, without getting too far into politics, is like really, I would say, left wing and believes in those things, it was really cool to see a society work like that. And of course there's arguments as to like why that can't be replicated everywhere, but I wouldn't say it was so much culture shock, but it was really interesting to, yes, like see how different societies can work, and how, certain things that you think, again, like just like would never work. You never could, if you had never been to somewhere like Sweden, you'd be like, oh, it would make no sense to pay people to go to school, or it would make no sense to just have a pass-fail system. But just seeing something work, it kind of just like opens your mind to just reconsidering your preconceived notions about things.
Sounds like you left the experience with a broader, more open-minded perspective on the world, just by the sheer nature of being in a different situation you hadn't been through before.
Yeah, I mean, and I've learned this continuously, like later, and that's one of the things I love about traveling, where, for example, the same thing is true in parts of Asia where, yes, there's a lot of scooter accidents, but it's incredible to see how you can be in a place with just like less traffic rules, and you're like, oh my God, if there's no traffic, like there's no way that like this is going to work, like there's no way. But then there's this like difference in the way that people interact on the road and how they actually have more respect for one another. And so it's just really interesting the more you travel to see certain systems work that you wouldn't expect to work.
So you came back from that experience, and leading up to what you did maybe a few years later, what did you approach life differently after the whole Sweden experience? Because you still, I guess, had to finish college and everything. Did it change like the trajectory of your life, you would say, or was it a minor effect? Were there major things that came out of you after you came back from Sweden?
One thing to mention is that it was really easy to just like fall back into the normalcy of like what everyone else was doing. And, you know, you like, I remember leaving exchange and like me and other people were like, we're not gonna just like fall back into things. Like we're gonna continue like traveling and pursuing like XYZ. And then like you get back and then you just like, you forget a lot of things. But I do remember coming back to my university because it was third year and you had to complete fourth year. Just like so many people being like, oh man, like I wish I did that. And like, just like having regrets about not making certain decisions. And I was like, wow, I never want to not do things and then regret them later because I'm like following the pack or whatever. And so I think after that, that really influenced my ability to make decisions based on like what I thought were important, what my values were, and what I wouldn't regret. If you ever hear of like Jeff Bezos, he talks about a lot of people make decisions based on minimizing risk. And he says like he makes decisions based on minimizing regret. And I feel like that was a little bit of a takeaway from that exchange experience where I was like, wow, had I just like minimized risk, I would have never had this experience. And then I want to make sure that I'm not making other decisions that are just purely minimizing risk, especially this early in my life. Like I should be minimizing regret because there's so many decisions that I'm going to be able to make in the future.
Then after college, so how did you get into the workforce and what was your first job and how did that whole thing come about?
Yeah, so my first job was in kind of like management consulting, and speaking to how you can just like fall back into things. I remember coming back and like at least at the university I went to, within like a month or two of the first semester starting, you have all these job fairs for anyone in final year, and just right away everyone's like, oh, I need to find a job, and all of a sudden you're like being brainwashed into this idea that you like need to find a job right away, and you're in competition with everyone else, and like you need to find the best job. So by like 2 months into that semester, I had like my job for the following year already locked in. And so, yeah, it was in consulting. And so I ended up doing that. I liked parts of it. I mean, it really fit this whole like analytical thing that I love. You guys have seen like I've written this like love letter to Excel that came from that phase of like my time in consulting. I remember sitting down like the first day and they give you obviously a mouse and a keyboard and a monitor and stuff, but they were like, see this thing, like you're not going to use it, and they were pointing to the mouse because they want to teach you how to just navigate without like a mouse and using like tons of shortcuts and things like that. And so
yeah, sorry, just for the audience who has not read your love letter to
we want to hear that love letter. Yeah,
like
tell
can
us
you summarize? Is it memorized?
It's not actually a love letter. I say it's a love letter because it is like an adoration I have with this thing. But Excel is just, it's incredible. It was created decades ago, and it is still like the most, I don't know what term to use here, but like it has stood the test of time. And in fact, today, when a lot of people are creating companies and they're looking at their competitors, they forget that one of their biggest competitors is Excel or Google Sheets these days, because of just like the sheer amount of things that it can do and just how intelligently it was crafted in its ability to accomplish many different things. And I think also most people I remember this feeling coming out of university. I was like, you know, when you have a resume and you put like, oh, like competent in like Microsoft Word, Microsoft Excel, like whatever. And you think if you know how to use like a sum function, you know how to use Excel, which is fine. But if you actually like really get into the depths of Excel and learn how to use it, it's incredible what you can do with it. And so anyway, that's what the article talks about. It talks a lot about the history, but also just this concept of like, it's actually amazing what you can do with this thing. And still to this day, like how much holding power it has after so much time.
There might be some consultants who are listening in and being like, I just love index match. I just love index match.
People who get it. Like like when they have also gotten into, you know, similar positions, like I've had people say similar stories where they like were taught not to use a mouse. They resonate with that. And anyone who's gotten to that depth of Excel, they're like, yes, it's the best thing ever. But anyway, yeah, I went into management consulting. It was great. But ultimately, like many of the lifestyle aspects that were related to that, like I was living in Toronto, I was commuting like round trip 2 hours a day, was working in like a very officey office, all of that. I was like, I just knew that based on prior experiences, especially through traveling, that I was kind of limiting myself and what I could do. And so I only was there for, I think, around 10 months, and then ended up switching to a fully remote position.
Well, it sounds like the seeds were definitely planted a while before. So, but it's not kind of necessarily top of mind that you would go then straight into thinking, okay, I want to live a nomadic life. Um, how did you come to that conclusion, and what were some of the considerations you had around that?
Yeah, so I remember the summer before I actually started working in that consulting role, I traveled the world with a friend. It was 4 months and we went to like, I think 4 continents, and we did
Wow.
like a crazy amount because we had the notion that that was like our last chance. As ridiculous as that sounds today, where now everyone works remotely, at that time, it was actually super rare. This is only 5, 6 years ago, maybe, but like it was super rare for remote jobs to exist. In fact, if you guys have ever heard of the company Remote Year, they had just launched a test for their first year, and they were the first one to do any of these like kind of work abroad group type things. And the reason I'm mentioning them is because I remember I was in a hostel with my friend at the end of this trip being like, wow, this is it. Like at some point in the future, we'll be able to like go on a vacation for a week or whatever. And that's it.
Hmm.
We're never going to be able to do this like round trip, or not even round trip, but like even a month long thing anywhere. And then maybe a month after starting in my job, a friend of mine sent me Remote Year. And I remember it was actually, again, it sounds silly now, but at the time it was like, oh, you can do this. Like people
Right.
work from their laptops and get to be wherever they want. And even separate from physically being in a different city, like I remember in university, I could not work from a library because I like being in like kind of active work environments like cafes and stuff. So I just remember being like, wait, like reading this in my office in Toronto, having just commuted for an hour, being like, there's a better way. Like I can have this flexibility that I want. And then I ended up spending the next 10 months or so looking for a job that I thought would like not trade away my career for this flexibility. But that really was an aha moment for me, just to be like, oh, like there is a better way. And like I don't have to, whatever I had convinced myself that like the trip that I had done for 4 months was the end, didn't actually have to be the end of that.
Totally, and it's completely different experience, right? I mean, I think there's one thing to say for, okay, I traveled and I worked in a place a month at a time, and then there's something around, staying somewhere for 6 months at a time, maybe a year, really getting to know the place, and then being able to quickly pack up and move on. It's a completely different experience.
Totally. And that's the nice thing about, I mean, when I had done those trips before working, it was very much like a backpackery thing. But now that I've been nomadic for several years, it's completely different to like live
Yeah,
and work in places. And it, now I've actually been in mostly the same place for over a year. And that's what I think is nice about remote work or flexible work, is just you can be wherever you want to be. So for some people, that means staying in the same spot for the next decade, and that's great.
mhm,
But for some people, it's moving every month, and there's a middle ground for wherever people want to be, whether it's like 6 months of the year, 4 months, 2 months, whatever. And that's what I think is really great about remote work, and what I hope other people are going to be able to leverage now that the whole world is doing
Yeah.
it.
totally. I mean, yeah, I think it's going to be a huge differentiator on being able to attract and retain talent for companies to be able to allow this. I guess one consideration, if you're thinking about going nomadic is, okay, well, I can't go somewhere like China. I can't speak, Mandarin. Has that ever kind of been a stop to you? Have you approached that?
So for me, not so much, just because the places I've tended to go have been already either like there's a lot of nomads, or it just happens to be like English. I'm lucky in that my first language is English and not some other language that like a fraction of the
Yeah.
world knows. So most of the time I'm fine. But obviously, if you wanted to go to more rural places, you're gonna have a harder time. But something to keep in mind is that, again, this is different from backpacking in that like most of the places that I've been, I need to go to there because they have good internet, right? So I can't go to like some very small town in Nepal because they won't have
Right.
the internet that I require, and most people require if they work online. And so by that nature, most of the time the places that I've been are more developed, and by more developed, probably more tourists, probably more expats, probably more people who speak English. And in general, if you go, a lot of the time I've spent ended up being in Asia, and in lots of like major parts of Asia, they do speak good English.
Yeah. I'm interested to know how you like approach, if you have like a framework or a structure to how you assess these things, because when you quit your job in consulting, technically you could have then moved to any country in the world. You could have then moved into any job that is remote. Did you have at least like some sort of like criteria in your head? How did, because like after you quit, what was your next step to figure out over that 10-month period, like what you actually move on to next?
Do you mean like where I want to go or like what I
I
work
guess
on?
all of the above, because to me, when I think about you quitting your job in Toronto after consulting, that's like step one. But step two is deciding, okay, out of all the options I have in terms of geography being a big one, in terms of type of job being a big one, how did you decide which things to pursue?
Yeah, so job wise for me, it was all about just, again, something I'm not trading away in my career. So, what's a job that I would actually accept had it not been remote? That was like
Right.
my
Oh, that's
criteria.
interesting.
It's
Okay.
And
great
then
thinking. Yeah.
if it's remote on top, that's what I need, like, or what I want in my life. But I would need that criteria to be true. I wrote an article about this. That's like the guide to remote work that's not trying to sell you anything. And this is like years ago, again, before now everyone's remote. But it was just this like 2x2 matrix, and it's like a great job that's not remote is much better than a shitty job that's remote. Because at the end of the day, remote is just adding flexibility to whatever you're already going to be doing. But at the end of the day, you're spending somewhere between 6 to 12 hours of your day at a job. And if it's shit, or if you're working on stuff that you don't enjoy or you're not passionate about, that's much worse than being able to do that even from like Bali on the beach, right? So it was really critical for me to find something that I was excited about, where I'd be learning. And yeah, again, like to kind of narrow it down, it was just a job that I would accept, even if it wasn't remote. And then in terms of where to go, the best part again about being remote is that you just have this infinite timeline. So you're not rushed to be like, oh, I need to optimize. Like if you have one vacation a year, you're like, okay, I need to go to the absolute best place and maximize my time. Instead, if you have an infinite horizon, you're more so just like, where do I want to go now? And so for me to start, I had lived in Scotland the summer after I had lived in Sweden. I did some research there, and
Nice.
I just really wanted to go back. So that was it. Like I could have gone somewhere new, somewhere a lot more exciting, but I was just like, I want to go like live in Scotland for a couple months. So I started there, and then I ended up traveling around a lot more over the coming years. But for me, it's just like, where do I want to be? And then I think I find over time, because one of the downsides of being nomadic is that it's harder to build community naturally as you're moving around.
Right.
I tend to gravitate more towards places with a lot of nomads already. And there's kind of these hubs that already exist. So one of them's in Canggu in Bali, one of them's in Chiang Mai, Lisbon, Medellin. There's a couple others, but overall, I tend to gravitate more towards those places just because they have the right infrastructure and they tend to have really good communities already set up there.
How are you? How are you? So we haven't actually covered like how did you actually start making that money then to sustain yourself?
Yeah, so I had like a full-time job. So I was really lucky. Well, I'd spent 10 months trying to be lucky and get this job, but I worked for a company called Toptal, which was at the time one of the few companies that I think I joined them when they were maybe somewhere between like 1 and 200 people, but like a sizable company that was
Mhm.
fully remote from the ground up, but also paid, you know, normal salaries. And so I was just getting paid as a salary or as a salaried employee at Toptal, and I was working on their growth team. So that's how I afforded it. But lots of other people, you know, create their own products and sell them online, you know, already have an existing business, some of them freelance. But for me, I was lucky to just have a salaried role.
Just so people get a sense of your like geographic journey. So you quit your job in Toronto in 2016, then start working at Toptal. And over the course of the next, I guess, 4 or 5 years since then, like where were you living? Was it a mixture of places? Was it just one or two places? Like I
Yeah,
just love to know your
it was
timeline, geographic
it was
timeline.
all over.
Everywhere.
I mean, it was literally at all 6 continents other than
Oh wow,
Antarctica.
really? Literally. Yeah.
But obviously some more than others. I mean, like within Africa, I only made it to South Africa.
Yeah.
But
Probably
it was
that's
across.
internet consideration there, probably, right?
Exactly, right. So, I mean, I would love to, there's many places that I'd love to travel one day, that maybe either I won't be working as much or they'll actually just have great infrastructure by that point. But I did make it to all 6 continents and or other than Antarctica, and then around, I think, over 50 countries over that time period. So I
Wow.
traveled a lot. I definitely slowed down closer to the end. And most of my time, like comparatively to other places, was spent in Canggu, especially by the end.
Got it. And so, what is your kind of wildest nomad story that you're allowed to tell on the podcast?
Um, I don't know what my wildest nomad story is, because when you're working as a nomad, like your life's actually not that interesting because you're like in a co-working space. But my wild story from when I was like backpacking was I had me and like 20 other people had to hitchhike in the middle of like the mountains in Laos, because we basically had to take this like overnight sleeper bus. And in Laos, there's like, it's definitely like, it doesn't have the infrastructure that you're used to in places like Canada. And basically they had one highway that took you from like one town to the next. And it's the only one. It's like in the mountains. And I guess two trucks for way further in front of us had crashed. I think one of them was driving on the wrong side of the road. They blocked the whole highway. And in that case, like you can't get through because it's the only highway. It's not like you can go take like a different road around the corner. It's the only one. And so we had to sleep in this gas station in the middle of nowhere overnight, just like on the ground. It was like an abandoned gas station. The next morning we had to like hitchhike. It was actually really fun. It was crazy. But in a place like Laos, I'm sure there's crime, but for the most part, we felt super safe. So it was actually kind of fun. But that was kind of a crazy story. And then, by the way, before all of that even happened, the bus that we were on, the driver wasn't supposed to do this, but like went and picked up a bunch of illegal Chinese immigrants because Laos actually borders with China.
Yeah, right.
And so they were like all they're in the bus, like sitting on the ground, and there's like babies puking everywhere. And we were actually the reason I'm mentioning that is because we were actually really excited to get off the bus and sleep in this gas station, just because it was like so hot and so cramped, because there was literally like 2.5 times the amount of people that were supposed to be on that bus. But anyway, traveling, when you encounter stuff like that, the time is kind of crazy, but I don't know, it was really fun in the end, especially once we had finally got to our destination.
I think some of the things that people, when they hear that you've traveled so many places, the doubts that people have who haven't done that probably come around certain things, like of course conveniences, but also maybe like safety and difficulty. Did you ever feel like, to someone maybe who's listening to you saying, oh my gosh, I could never do that, I'd be scared to travel and backpack across Laos, like did you ever feel uncomfortable, or how would you respond to someone who probably has that concern if they haven't done that before?
I mean, everywhere you go, whether it's like downtown Toronto or some like small town in Laos, has safety concerns in the sense that you have to know where you are, know like what you should be aware of. But most of the places that I've traveled have been relatively safe. Southeast Asia is actually, I feel a lot safer there than in certain places in North America. And I've heard this consistently from other people who have traveled also to many places around the world. And I feel like I'm gonna get canceled for saying this, but like the one thing that I find in Southeast Asia relative to other places in the world is that the amount of money that they have is not like a linear relationship with crime, in the sense that if you go to places like, I don't know, like even parts of North America or Latin America or Europe, if you're in a poor neighborhood, like people don't have money, and this is not me judging these people, it makes sense why there's more crime. You see a major increase in crime, right? Because they don't have the resources that they need. But in Southeast Asia, you just meet so many kind of not wealthy people, and in fact, extremely poor people. And the levels of crime there they're so low, so incredibly low. In places like Bali and Vietnam and Thailand and Laos, like all of these places, I've felt so incredibly safe. And of course, I'm not saying there's no crime there, but there are places in the world that I think are judged based on their past or just them being foreign countries. But I would encourage people to like open their minds a little bit and know that even where you live, there's safety precautions that you should take. And just, as long as you're smart and you know where you're going and why you're there and what you should be careful of, you'll be fine.
I love that. And actually, that makes me kind of want to ask a little bit more. So, what are the top pieces of advice you'd give to someone who's wanting to do something like this?
I mean, I think that the important thing to note, and this came from the same article about like the guide to remote work, not trying to sell you anything, is like the whole idea of working remotely and being able to travel is it's just a way to explore and find the things that you like. It's not an end goal. It's not something that you should do for 6 years. I see, on my travels, I've met people who have done that, and quite honestly, most of them seem very unhappy. And I'm not surprised, because at the end of the day, what humans seek in life is community. They do seek some sort of routine, even if it's not like a strict routine. They adhere to familiarity and things that they like and can enjoy. And the reason for that is because the more that you do something, the deeper it gets, right? Like your relationships or, your ability to increase or get better with a skill. Like all of that comes with time. And the thing about being super nomadic, and by nomadic I mean hopping around everywhere, it means that like your experiences and the things that you do every day are constantly changing. And that's great for a period of time because that allows you to learn. But it's not a great long-term goal. And so I encourage people to view it from that lens. And if people have ever heard, it's a framework in computer science, or it's like a term in computer science, which is like exploring versus exploiting, where basically everything in life, whether it's your relationships or whether you're in a new place and you don't know whether to try a new restaurant or one that you already like, it's this balance between like, should you explore, try new things, or should you exploit what you already know that you like? And it's the same framework for going and being nomadic, where you should use a certain period of time to go and explore and use that just to learn as much as you can. What places do you like? Do you like being by the ocean or by mountains? Do you like living in big cities or small places with more community? What do you like? Why do you like it? And then use that to then decide, you know what, this place is pretty cool and I like want to spend quite a bit of time here. Or maybe you settle down on 2 places and you spend 6 months and 6 months. But I think it's really important that a lot of people, especially including myself, when they first start, think, okay, I'm going to go and just like move around for the rest of my life and it's going to be super exciting. But really the things that make you happy come with depth. And so I would encourage people to view things from that perspective as, rapid travel as a way to learn and then incorporate those learnings into something more long-term.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Steph, I think that is so important, and I'm really curious to know like how you think about it now, because what I personally experienced over the last year, given COVID and stuff, is really reassessing where I want to spend my time geographically, and obviously who with and what to do. And I've probably had like more of a come to Jesus moment about this now because of COVID than any other time in my life, and I've done a lot of traveling, lived in a lot of countries. So from your perspective, especially given the state of the world, do you have those takeaways for yourself? Like, okay, I've realized that I want to spend more time here with these types of people, or this type of place, a big city, small town. Like, what are your takeaways given the state of the world right now about what you want to do moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, mine are going to be different from everyone's, but for me, I've found that even though I grew up in Toronto, I love being in smaller places. I love being able to like walk and bike, and like whenever I go back to Toronto and a friend is like, hey, you want to go for lunch? I'm like, okay, how do I bank like 3.5 hours of my day for lunch?
Yeah.
Versus one of the things I love in small places is it's like, oh, that's like an hour of your day, right? And it's just so easy, and you can get to things and people so easily. So I really like small places. I like obviously good weather.
Yeah.
If it's funny, because if you actually I'm sure you guys have heard of Nomad List, and there's similar sites that basically you wonder why places like Chiang Mai and Canggu and Lisbon and Medellin are nomad hotspots, and it's all just the convergence of a couple data points. It's like good weather, relatively cheap, good internet, like English speaking, there's just a couple things that feed into that, and you end up getting these really great places. And so for me, I tend to kind of lean towards those angles of, again, like small, easy to navigate, good community. And honestly, that's enough for me. Like, I don't need much else other than that. But for other people, I'm sure they'll have other criteria.
And I bet good weather is particularly poignant for you because you're from Toronto. So similar to me from London.
I mean, I don't know about you, but when I was younger, like not even that long ago, I used to convince myself that I liked winter. I used to be like, I'm born in like December.
It's a coping mechanism.
Christmas time. I know, and I'm like, I don't mind winter. Like, it's totally fine. I don't know why people complain about it so much. And then as soon as it's funny because actually nomads, again, because of the places they tend to go, people say they're like escaping winter. And ever since I've escaped winter for like 3 years or whatever, I can confidently say that it is really nice to not have severe winters.
And one of the other things I picked up on that I really like that you said around the kind of exploring versus exploiting is, you've listed here as one of the main kind of changes that happened in your life was when you started to read again and when you started to learn to code. And I think that's interesting to pull that analogy into, start learning or getting entrenched in the things you already know. So maybe talk about, your experience in learning to read again. Learning to read. You already knew how to read. Starting to read again.
Well, I mean, I hadn't read in a long time, so probably a reminder.
Needed to get your reps in. No, and learning to code in 2018. What was that like?
Yeah, so I think we talked a little bit about this before we jumped on, but I think in general, your life comes in phases. And, when you first, like when you're first born, you learn to do a couple things. You learn to build relationships with the people around you. Then you go to school, you learn to do math and read and write and all these things. And then when you're getting older, you specify and you learn even more things in depth. But there's all these phases where you're like forced to learn things. And then you hit a certain point and then all that stops, right? And up until then, a lot of your learning was forced, probably for the benefit of you, but it was forced in a way where it's like you had to do this. And so you don't really have often this conviction to go and continue that, right? In fact, a lot of people are excited. They're like, I never have to write an essay again, or like, I never have to take a test again. And I just think that after you graduate university, or really maybe your first couple of years of your job, you're at this point where a lot of people flatline. And I saw this tweet earlier that I think kind of encapsulates this. And it's just this graph, if you can imagine it. And it's like this, you're increasing over time. And then once you hit around maybe like 25, 27, you literally flatline. And the quote says, most men die at 27. We just bury them at 72. And so I think it was really interesting for me to just start again a couple of years ago. Once I had gotten my first couple of jobs, worked my way up, started leading teams, I'm like, what else? I just kind of reverted back to some of the baseline things, like learning to read again or learning to code, and just teaching myself to continuously learn and make that something that I want to do. And not just with these baseline things, but hopefully throughout many, many years up until like whenever I die, maybe 72, but not have this flatlining happen. So even though it seemed like really minuscule to just like start reading again or learn to code, those were like really defining moments. And that really changed the way that I view how I spend my time and how I want to continue spending my time.
It kind of comes back to me to the point you raised earlier around, you were doing, and I also want to get into this at some point as well, the chess tournaments, when you were
Yes.
growing up, and you were learning so many new skills on the side of school. Um, so why is it that, we kind of, in your opinion, that we kind of stop learning and we just plateau? And secondly, what early on can we do to ensure that we have like a broad enough spectrum of interests so that later on it's easier to pick them back up?
It's a good question. I mean, I think one of the reasons that we stop learning is that humans are very, I guess all of us work by incentives, in the sense that you need to, like, even if you're trying to get someone to do something, don't think, how do I convince someone to agree with me? Think about the incentives that need to be in place to actually get them to achieve what you want them to do. And so because we're so incentive driven, most of the time short-term incentive driven, early on we're forced to learn because, okay, you get an A on your paper, or you get let into the next university, or you get a higher paycheck. But then after that, there's no incentives, no short-term incentives to actually want to learn, right? There are certainly long-term ones. So for example, I am just starting to maybe really reap the benefits of some of the things that I did years ago, right? And sometimes it doesn't even happen that quickly. And so that is the reason I think people stop learning, is there's just no societal incentive that they can really latch on to quickly. And so that ties into something that I think is just the way that a lot of people view life isn't necessarily wrong, but is almost doing themselves a disservice in the horizons that they look at, right? So I think a lot of people, again, without meaning to, just see really short term, and they can't see the like long-term goal. And if they could, that would be enough, hopefully, of an incentive to be like, oh, even though maybe I don't want to be a developer, if I'm going to be alive for the next 50 years, I probably should understand how technology works, right? When you have that long-term view of where you're going to be in this like quickly changing world, you start to understand why like continuously learning is important. But without that view, I think it's hard to see through all the noise. So I think that's why most people don't learn, in addition to the fact that because of the way our schools are set up, you're never, kind of related to the first conversation we had about Sweden, you're not incentivized in many schools to learn the material and like understand how you're better for knowing this. You're incentivized to like get a grade or pass a course. And so somehow teaching people, I'm not sure what the right answer is here, but teaching someone to really love learning and to want to just naturally, like intrinsically want to get better at something, I don't
Yeah.
know the answer to that, but that is something that I see missing as well. In terms of actually educating people early on, in terms of, different skills, I think it's all about just like getting, but like if you have kids, putting them into as many things as possible, so that they have a little bit of exposure to everything, and so that later on they might have been terrible at something in the past. For example, writing. I used to be terrible at writing, but just even a little bit of exposure to something gives you the context, so that it doesn't seem so foreign to you. But then also teaching your kids that, or teaching yourself even later on, that you can have new perspectives, like renewed perspectives, like on writing. I used to think I was a terrible writer. I still don't think I'm amazing, but coming at it from a different angle at a different point in your life, sometimes you find that things are actually, you're really good at this, or like you can come at it from a new angle. And so I think just having a different mindset about things not being stagnant and that things can change over time is really what allows people to revisit things and, not be afraid to be a beginner.
One of the things that I know you're passionate about, or people at least ask you a lot, is about the idea of building in the open. And if you go to like your website, you've written a lot, you've got some books you've published. Did that come from the sort of growth mindset in like 2017 we started reading again? Because with the amount of content you're putting out there and building in the public, where did that come from? Did that come from that turning point where you started to read and code again?
Yeah, so I think the reason I started to build in public was there was a specific set of events, but one in particular where I had learned to code over 6 months or so and I wasn't building public. And then I created my first project and I launched it and it got some attention, not very much. And there was one tweet that was kind of like, hey, I like spent the last 6 months learning to code. Here's my first project or whatever. And it got a bunch of likes and retweets and attention. And I was excited at first because I'm like, oh, people like my project. And no one cared about the project. In fact, a lot of people were just like, wow, it's so cool that you learned to code. How do I do this? Like, what courses did you take? And it was like this little seed where I was like, people aren't always interested in the outcome of something. They're interested in the journey. And like, there's a quote that I consistently share. I didn't come up with it, but it's like, if you are if you're like your car breaks down on the side of the road, people are much more likely to like pull over and help you if you're already pushing your car, right? And so the sentiment of like, if you're sharing what you're doing and you're a little bit more open and transparent about what you're trying to achieve, so not just what you're doing but why you're doing it and where you're hoping to go, people will actually help you do that. And I just like slowly started testing things out. Like the next project I did, I started sharing like mock-ups before I had even started working on it. And I just recognized that if you believe in this concept of like ideas versus execution, and if you believe that ideas really aren't that worth that much and it's all execution, you shouldn't be afraid at all to share your ideas, because you're confident that you can execute it, and you'll in fact just get more positive feedback and support from other people helping you execute. So I just started to test that out and validate it. And I found consistently over time that sharing those ideas actually helped me more than it hurt me. And I can't actually, maybe there will be a time where it hurts me, but I can't actually think of a time thus far where it's really impacted me in a negative way.
Yeah, I mean, you covered one of the things I wanted to ask on that one, and I think like it's all very well sharing your successes. It's all very well saying this is where I want to go. It's all very well saying, this is an idea and I'm starting to build it. I think where people start to really question building in public is like, do I share my failures? Do I share the parts where I'm actually maybe potentially more vulnerable? And I think that's particularly true. Maybe not so much if you're teaching yourself something like coding. People are going to come to the rescue and help you on something. But if you're building a product in public, you're essentially in some ways you could be giving competitive analysis away, something that can help folks build against you or make you feel more vulnerable. So there is kind of another side of it, which I'm always curious about, and I'm not sure. It sounds like you haven't had any bad experiences yourself yet, but have you seen anyone who would, and how can you kind of think about mitigating those?
Yeah, so I definitely have seen other people. I have a friend of mine who created a product and like he launched it super successful, and then basically there was like exact replicas of it. Wow. Days or weeks later, and then in fact people were coming back to him and thought that his thing was replicating theirs. And so there definitely can be pitfalls to building in open. However, I would say that what happened to him could happen to anyone, even if they're not building in public. Mm-hmm. Like had he launched it and not built in public beforehand, someone would have still copied his work. And so I just think that sure, you can as an individual decide how open and transparent you want to be. That's, that's your decision, and it'll impact how much people kind of adhere to your story, for better or for worse. But at the end of the day, what I would encourage people not to focus on is like trying to perfect that, like trying to perfect exactly how much information they're releasing. Because at the end of the day, what will make you successful is the work that you put in and how you execute over a long period of time, not some little pieces of information. I mean, literally, if Amazon released every single piece of information that they had about how they do things, exactly how many sales they have, exactly how much they pay their employees, if they released every piece of information, no one could build what Amazon has, because Jeff Bezos spent, and all the people around him spent, decades building this, right? And so I'm not saying companies should go out and literally just like release every single aspect of what they do, but I would just kind of caution the narrative around like, if I share this information, then other people are going to use this against me. Because if you truly believe that your business is that fragile, then I would be more worried about that than
Yeah.
the other side of the coin.
Now, Steph, I guess it kind of brings us to what you're doing today. So you've had this long journey from Sweden to pretty much all over the world to now you being in California. Today, like, what are you focusing most of your time on? I know, like, you're working full time as the head of trends for the Hustle, but on top of that, what are the other priorities you have? Maybe you could talk about trends as well, people that don't know about it.
Sure. I mean, Trends is just, it's the paid publication at the Hustle, and we try to predict what is going to happen. Obviously, there's no guarantees, but the Hustle itself was a daily newsletter. And the way Sam, the founder, liked to explain it was like your friend going and reading all the news for the day and then coming back to you and telling you what you should care about. No BS, no jargon. Trends is like, imagine that same friend going out into the future 5 years and coming back and being like, hey, you should really think about this,
Yeah.
or you bet you don't see this coming, type of thing. And so we try to surface those trends, and it can be something super small, like, oh, people are starting to buy this stuff online, to something really, really big, right? Like this technology is going to completely reshape how the world operates. And so that's what I work on. I used to write more for Trends, and now I more so lead the product and focus on product and growth. But that's what I do at Trends. And then outside of that, I'm always kind of just tinkering with things, building things on my own, writing. And the reason that I did write a book recently, and that was monetized. But overall, the reason that I love just being able to work on Trends and have a job is that I can just have fun on the side, where I'm not dependent on my kind of like creator projects to make me money, because in that case, if there's no motivation around them other than just, I enjoy this, I have fun with it, I'd be doing this even if I'm not getting paid, because I'm not. I'm not getting paid, and I'm getting paid elsewhere.
That's great. And so how do you come up with the trends? Is it literally qualitatively reading things and assimilating the information? Are you using data? Presumably yes, because of your love for Excel.
Yeah, I mean, most, if not all of the things that we do are based on some sort of data set. And it can come from somewhere like Google Trends or Ahrefs or Jungle Scout, but it comes from all different sources. Sometimes it is just hearing, ever since I started working on Trends, I'll just be in a conversation. For example, I went to the eye doctor the other day and got tested. And then like, as I'm doing the eye test, I like look at the tech, or like the software they're using, and I was like, like, I wonder what software that is. And I like looked them up, and then, found out the company that runs this, that also runs this other stuff. And so once you start looking for trends, you see it everywhere. Similarly, like
Mm.
I went to Florida recently, and I noticed like they don't have any hard kombucha, but in California, they have like massive segments in their grocery stores for hard kombucha. And I'm like, this is, going to take off. And surely enough, you look in Google Trends, like hard kombucha is like just starting to take off. So I think ever since I started working on trends, it's been really cool, because you can, if you just have like this different way of thinking about the world, where you're just asking questions about like, oh, why do you do it like this? Or like, I was at the dentist and I'm like, when did you get that piece of tech? Like, I've never seen that before. You just start to see opportunities, and that's been super cool. So sometimes it is word of mouth or seeing things yourself, but everything that we do end up writing about, we try to kind of augment with some sort of data.
And there's also a like Facebook group that is for like all the trends members, right? So part of it is community, right? Like, do you manage that as well, and how does that work?
Yeah, so I manage all of Trends, so that does include the community. And so, yeah, it's really interesting because Trend started as a newsletter, as a written product, but then it expanded into a couple other things, including events. But community is the one that a lot of people now don't even read the newsletter. Some of them don't read the newsletter, but just stick around for the community, because imagine like the arc of an entrepreneur. There's a point of time where they're like looking for ideas and they're trying to validate their ideas. But then once they're executing and building a business, like they don't care what the next new big thing is in like dental software. They care what they're building and like tactics around that. And hey, does anyone know like how to like optimize these Facebook ads or whatever? And so that's where the community comes in, where they get support in actually doing the things that they want to do. And so, yeah, a lot of people these days say actually the Facebook community is the best part of the product for them.
That's really interesting. I'm a big fan of the Hustle. I'm not a Trends member, I'm sorry, but I'm a big fan of what the Hustle does. And naturally, the fact that Ben and I have a podcast, we also do a lot of writing, really interested in media and, the hot topics like the creator economy and stuff. Considering you're kind of at the forefront of some of this stuff, what's your latest sort of take on what are the exciting things, in your opinion, happening in media now, or things that people need to pay more attention to? Just love to get your take on how media is evolving and maybe the creator economy, and just what you're most interested in given that topic.
It's such a good question. I mean, I think the main theme that has been talked about so many times, before me, is just the ability for anyone to go out and be a creator and start their own media brand. Basically, I mean, that's basically what Sam did with Hustle many years ago. So I think that's awesome. I'm not just saying this because I'm on a podcast. I think audio is like, there's just so much more to be done with audio. And the reason for that is, I think there's still a lot to be done with like written media as well, and video. But if you think about even 5 years ago, when people were like, oh, should I start a blog? Should I not? Is there like too much competition? And it turns out, no, like there was still so much space. I think audio is like that, where it's just like a lot of people are excited about it. There's a lot of podcasts. But up until recently, there wasn't a good way to parse through podcasts, search podcasts, to like memorialize the content in a podcast. And that has all been kind of restrictive in people's ability to get value from audio, right? You listen to it once, but then you never revisit it again. You can't share it. You can't actually digest the information in like effective ways, versus obviously all the things that you can do with written content or media. And so I think there's going to be a lot of interesting stuff happening there. And once those pieces come together, I just think that audio is actually a better form for certain types of media, where you can go on your run and listen to a podcast. You can wash dishes and, listen to a podcast. And so I think audio is really, really interesting. I'm not as bullish on Clubhouse, which a lot of people are bullish on.
Hot take.
But I think that audio overall has a lot of potential.
I completely agree. Also not bullish on Clubhouse.
Whoa, I kind of am, guys. I'm kind of bullish on Clubhouse, but let's see. Let's agree. Let's see what happens. Let's have another podcast in a year and see where Clubhouse is.
Okay, we'll make a bet.
Okay, should we do a live bet on the podcast right now? I don't know what the parameters would be, but let's take a stand on Clubhouse. I'm bullish.
We'll do one Bitcoin each, and no, I'm kidding.
So the one thing that we touched on earlier, which I have to touch on before we close, chess competitions. Queen's Gambit fever is a thing right now. You were doing it when you were young. Tell us a little bit about that. And should we teach chess in schools?
I think definitely. But yeah, I used to play chess competitively as a kid. Was on Team Canada. Both me and my sister. Nice. She was much better than me. Used to travel around North America, but also go to like the World Chess Championships. And it's funny because actually now, so I quit quite early. I quit around 12, but I started when I was like maybe 6 or something.
Right.
But
that's very young to start chess.
Really?
That's awesome.
Well, that's the thing. I don't even know. I say the number 6, but I don't actually remember learning chess. Like it was at some point in my life where it was funny because I was actually watching the Queen's Gambit, and my boyfriend doesn't know how to play chess. So I was like, explaining to him like the rules, like, okay, so pawn can move 1 or 2 spaces, but only 2 if it's the first move, things like that. And I was like, oh my God, like I've never like thought about the rules of chess, like because I learned it so early on that
Ingrained in you.
it's
Yeah.
just, yeah, I just like see the board and understand what's going on.
You
And
see it on the
so
ceiling.
not on the ceiling, but it was funny because I would watch the show and
Yeah.
I'd be like, she's gonna sacrifice her queen and like win on like F3 or whatever, you know? And so they actually depicted it very well, by the way, other than like, I don't know, like her visualizing stuff 3D and whatever. Like, I don't think people maybe see that, maybe they do. But in any case, I played chess competitively as a kid, and up until recently, I didn't really think about how it impacted like the way I think, or maybe the fact that I lean towards being analytical or things like that. But more recently, I've kind of thought back to it and I'm like, wow, I think it actually did in a very like fundamental way define how I see the world. And it comes from, well, one, being chess is just like a complex game, and so you're always thinking ahead, you're always thinking about how what you do and how someone will react, and how you get to a winning position. But then also simple things like just the fact that in a game of chess you can start like black or white, and you can't control what someone else does. You're only responsible for what you can do, what you can take action on. To also the fact that when you're playing chess, some of the things that I thought the Queen's Gambit did really well were represent some of the like intricacies of chess, like the fact that you have a rating and that you have to study chess to get better, and you study openings and you read books and you go to tournaments and your rating goes up or down based on everything you do. Being able to like quantify your progress towards something after a very long time horizon, like even though I played chess for many years, there were still so many people better than me, right? And so, but being able to like really, really quantify your progress towards something, I think impacted my ability to like push towards like learning new skills and being okay if things are relatively slow. So some of those, and then even just when I was little, I was, again, like 10 years old, and you would play in world championships and stuff around or against players of your gender and your age. But outside of those tournaments, you'd go to like a chess tournament in Toronto and you'd play against, they'd call it just like the Open, and you'd play against like a 50-year-old man or whatever. And so I think that was also a really great experience early on, just to kind of like break certain barriers or stereotypes and just realize that, again, if you put in hard work and you learn, you can become really good at everything or anything, despite what people may expect of you as like a 10-year-old girl. So I definitely think that chess can teach people some really, really like fundamental things about the world and how to learn and how to improve. And I think that it's one of, I think it'd be actually much more effective at doing that than something like, having a class on some of those exact same topics.
And I think, I mean, I love it. And the analogy of, you either start on white or on black as well. I think that's really interesting because, I mean, you know, just even in terms of just the family you're born into, you might get dealt almost kind of an underdog hand, right? But it still gives you the parameters to get a competitive advantage over a period of time.
Yeah, and you learn to get better. I think that was like something really fundamental about chess. A lot of people don't realize, if you've never played competitive chess, people think, just like there's like people who are naturals at soccer or some other sport, there are people who maybe pick up the game more quickly. But if you are going to be incredible at chess, you study chess, and you study it just like they show in the show, where like you play a game and if you lose or you win, you study it after. You sit down with your coach and you're like, okay, was this, maybe now it's easier actually because you can sit down with a computer and it'll tell you exactly what the right move is, but you're sitting there and they're like, oh, actually, do you see how that move opened up your king in this way and put you at risk of XYZ, and that's how you ended up like 30 moves later losing, right? And so you really study it, you read books, you just work towards it in a way that I think a lot of people don't appreciate if you've never played chess, but also in a way that I would hope that people kind of view life, right? Where it's like, a lot of people say, I'm put in this position and I don't have certain resources. And I'm not kind of discrediting them at all, but just no matter where you are, one of the best books I've ever read is Man's Search for Meaning. You always have a choice, and you have a choice to react and how to, position yourself perhaps over a long period of time to get better and to put yourself in a position where you succeed in the future. So same thing in chess, where you might lose a game, but studying it after, understanding what went wrong, will put you in a better position so that you're, if in a similar game, you won't lose the next time.
I think that's a topic that we could happily talk about for hours on the ways to find motivation, have a growth mindset, even gamification, taking analogies from sport and chess to like instruct you in life. But Steph, thank you so much for being here today. And before we close, we've got two traditional questions that we ask our guests. The first one is slightly more lighthearted, and the second one slightly more serious. So the first one, I'll ask you right now. What is your favorite romantic comedy?
Oh God. I don't know. Um, I feel like they're all the same, right?
Totally fine. Well, maybe there's
They're
one
all
that you like more than
No,
others.
you need to submit. We have to push you for this.
I'm not sure. Man, I haven't watched a romantic comedy in so long. I feel like The Proposal is really funny.
Okay.
But I don't I feel like I'm like failing this question, but
Okay.
I'm not sure. I was saying to someone this actually yesterday where my interest in like TV shows and movies are like really really high quality, either like documentaries or like really low quality things like The Bachelor or like Are You the One, or like really bad shows. So anywhere in the middle, which I think probably romantic comedies fall into, I just don't spend that much
All
time
good.
with.
So we'll take The Proposal as your final answer for now, though, if that's okay. And that's totally
Okay,
fine.
great.
It's a great answer.
And second question is, you're sitting across the table from your 18-year-old self. What advice would you give her?
Yeah, I think that, so maybe actually instead of me giving advice, I'll just read off my favorite quote from Steve Jobs, which I think encapsulates everything that I wish I knew earlier on. And here, I'll just read it out. It's when you grow up, you tend to get told that the world is the way it is and that your life is just to live inside of that world. Or sorry, I'm butchering this quote, but
We'll
basically
start it again. Start it again.
We'll edit
Okay.
this out. Don't worry.
Okay, when you grow up, you tend to get told the world is the way it is, and your life is just to live inside of that world. Try not to bash into the walls too much, try to have a nice family, have fun, save a little money. But that is a very limited life. Life can be much broader once you discover one simple fact. Everything around you that you call life was made up by people that were no smarter than you, and you can change it, you can influence it, you can build your own things that other people can use. And once you learn that, you'll never be the same again. So, really, it's just this idea where everything that we see, everything that we think was taught to us. Maybe not what we see, but like our perception of the world was taught to us. It's not something that we molded on our own. And a lot of that is good because you learn how to interpret the world, you learn how to learn new skills, but a lot of it is often not helpful for you, right? Because it shelters you from new ways of thinking and your ability to think differently from what others have taught you to do. And so I think just it's been really really influential for me to realize that like I can reshape my own reality, and also in doing that I can hopefully if I work hard and try to add value to the world, I actually can in some ways reshape other people's reality. And I think that's a much better way to reshape other people's reality. Right now there's a lot of public discord around certain topics and a lot of people yelling at each other and upset and trying to convince someone else that they should believe what they think. They're trying to reshape someone's reality by telling them what they should believe instead of just actually trying to add value to the world, and create a better world through your actions instead of your words. And so that quote I think kind of encapsulates what I think I wish I knew years ago and what I wish other people really internalized as well.
I absolutely love it. That actually reminded me of a Dr. Zeus quote as well that I love. I'll share it with you after this, but no,
Okay, great.
that's amazing.
Yeah, that Steve Jobs quote. I've heard that before. I think that's amazing. I think I said that. I used to try to watch that fairly often, like every other day, every other week. I try to even like implant that in my head. But Steph, thank you so much. Where should people find you? How do they get in touch with you? Twitter, your website,
You should
obviously,
get in touch. Yeah.
trends.
Yeah, you can, I guess I'm most publicly vocal on Twitter, so my handle is Steph Smith IO because my website is stephsmith.io. So if you want to check out any of my projects or my blog, you can find them there. And then yes, if you're interested in trends, trends.co is the URL. So yeah, those are some of the places you can find me.
Great. Thank you, Steph. It's been wonderful.
Thanks so much, guys.